Welcome to Trekzone Live. Matt Miller with you. It is a very cold and chilly morning here at Trekzone HQ, but these computer monitors are keeping me warm, and I'm seeing that we are standing by for launch. We're about half an hour away from the launch of the Crew Dragon capsule aboard that Falcon 9 rocket. Those astronauts are standing by to make history. It'll be the first time since 2011 that Cape Canaveral has launched humans into orbit since the space shuttle retired. Today, here on Talkin Science Live, it's our first live produced, it's our first actual live show. Of course, we are live producing Talkin Science Uncut on Saturdays. But today, Dr. Andy Thomas is going to join me for some commentary about launching on the space shuttle. Dr. Andy Thomas is, of course, Australia's first astronaut, so far our only astronaut. He flew on 4 shuttle missions, spent over 140 days on the Mir space station. So I think he's well qualified to tell us exactly how these astronauts are feeling as we count down to launch. And of course, as we do on every Talkin Science show, Dr. Brad Tucker will be with me to give some an analysis of exactly what this mission is all about. But first, we've got to get into the opener, then we'll take you live to the Cape. This is Talkin Science Live.
Across Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts and YouTube, this is Talking Science with Dr. Brad Tucker and Matt Miller.
Alrighty, well, a live shot there of the Cape, the Falcon 9 rocket standing by for launch. The Crew Dragon capsule sealed, pressurized, and standing by. We are under 30 minutes to launch. This is the Trekzone live stream. Thanks very much for joining me. I know you've got your choice of live streams, and it's fantastic to have your company throughout the morning here on Trekzone Live. Let's go to an Australian astronaut, so far Australia's only astronaut, Dr. Andy Thomas. He joined me at the World Science Fair in Brisbane back in 2016. We spoke about his shuttle missions. He flew on 4 of them, in fact, including one that helped build the International Space Station. That was STS-114, for those of you playing along at home. Having flown on 4 missions and spent over 140 days on the space station, I think he's pretty well qualified to talk about how the astronauts are feeling as the countdown to ignition gets closer and closer. Here is Dr. Andy Thomas speaking with me in 2016.
Today's guest is so far Australia's only astronaut. His name is Dr. Andy Thomas, and he's joining me from the World Science Fair, happening for the first time outside of New York in Brisbane. Dr. Thomas, thanks for your time. What inspired you to be an astronaut?
Well, when I was growing up, it was the early days of the space program. I remember, I'm old enough to remember the flights of Alan Shepard and John Glenn. And of course, I remember the moon landings very clearly. I was a student at university. And I looked at those and thought, what a great adventure. Wouldn't it be amazing to be involved in that? But for a kid growing up in Adelaide, that wasn't a very realistic prospect. But later in life, after I'd got an engineering degree and a PhD, I realized I could actually make that dream come true. And I then focused my career to getting the kind of credentials that I thought would be needed to become an astronaut, and I was successful in applying.
Well, you managed to achieve that with a Bachelor of Engineering in Mechanical Engineering with first-class honours from the University of Adelaide. And then you moved to the US and worked with Lockheed Martin throughout the 80s. In '92, you were selected by NASA and spent 12 months training to join the astronaut corps. What did that involve?
Yeah, I should say I also got a PhD at the University of Adelaide, and I think that was actually a pivotal education step that I needed in order to apply to the astronaut program. My first flight was, as you said, in 1996, and that was a 10-day mission on the shuttle Endeavour. And that was preceded by a year of pretty intensive training on the specific systems that we were going to fly on that mission, as well as on all the systems that make the shuttle operate, because we had to operate the vehicle safely. And that's the kind of thing you typically do when you're training for a specific flight.
Before you flew in space, you worked as an astronaut support person. What does that role involve?
Oh, that was actually an assignment I had. While you were waiting for a flight or between flight assignments, NASA give you a job to support the overall flight program. And the first one I had after I finished my astronaut candidacy training was what they call an astronaut support person, which is the role you have to go down to the Cape and act as a liaison between what the people are doing to process the launch vehicles at the Cape and the astronaut office, which is back in Houston. So I spent a lot of time going back and forth to Cape Canaveral and working with the launch directors. And then ultimately I had the role on one flight, STS-59, I remember it, to actually assist the crew strapping in on day of launch and closing the hatch on them and sending them on their way.
That must have been a surreal experience to strap in those astronauts and send them off to space.
It was. And one of the things you get to do is you go out to the launch pad about 5 hours before the actual launch, and of course there's no one there because of the dangers, and it's very quiet, and you have the whole shuttle to yourself. You're just sitting in the shuttle by yourself, listening to the communication loops, and it's usually the middle of the night, and that was a very surreal moment. And it made me realize just what an exciting adventure I was involved in.
Well, you served as mission specialist on flights STS-77, 102 and 114, logging more spaceflight hours than any other Australian. How does it feel to be Australia's pioneer of space?
A little humbled. I have to admit that I'm guilty of the sin of pride that I did become the first Australian citizen to fly in space. I've had, as you remarked, 4 flights. And that's 4 more than I ever expected to get, and they've been amazing flights. And I look back on it with great fondness, but also, to this day, a certain element of disbelief that I actually got to do that.
One of those missions involved 141 days aboard Mir. What's it like living on a space station?
You know, the flight on Mir was perhaps the most important in my career. And it was one of the highlights, if not the highlight, of my spaceflight career, because I preceded that by spending a year in Russia training to become a cosmonaut. And when I was growing up in Adelaide, I might have dreamed of being an astronaut, but I never in my wildest dreams thought I could become a cosmonaut. But I got to do that, had to learn Russian, and then I went on board the Mir space station with 2 cosmonauts who didn't speak English, and spent 20 weeks there, and it was an extraordinary experience. It was one of the great experiences of my life, being weightless for 20 weeks and enjoying orbiting the Earth 16 times a day for 20 weeks.
What are the differences between a cosmonaut and an astronaut?
There's really not many. The only distinction is that a cosmonaut learns to operate a Russian spacecraft, an astronaut learns to operate a NASA spacecraft.
Having spent time on Mir and flying 2 missions to build the International Space Station, how does it make you feel to watch fellow astronauts like Commander Scott Kelly spend a full year in space?
I respect him for that. A year would be a tough flight, but I could have done it. Time flows very quickly when you're in space. It becomes a very tranquil experience, actually, when you're up there. I watch the people that are flying today, and I have to admit to a certain amount of envy that they're getting to fly. Even though I've had some great flight experiences, sometimes I feel a pang of jealousy that they're flying, and it'd be nice to fly again, but I have no complaints.
Are there any plans for you to return to flight?
Not for me, no. I retired from the agency 2 years ago, and I've hung up the flight suit and I'm leaving it for a younger generation.
Well, speaking of that younger generation, what do you think is next for human space exploration?
I think what we're going to see is we'll continue to fly the space station for about another 10 years, and we'll use that to test out the basic systems we need to go beyond low Earth orbit. I think then you'll see a return to lunar space, not necessarily to the lunar surface, but to lunar orbit perhaps, where we'll deploy a deep space habitat that will let us evaluate how those habitats operate and what is required to support them for long periods of time in space. And that'll give us the basic engineering we need in order to fly missions to Mars, because sending humans to Mars is the holy grail of human space exploration, to which all the agencies really aspire.
Well, short of our own space agency, how does an Australian become an astronaut?
Right now, there is not a career path for an Australian to fly in space because Australia does not have a relationship with NASA to fly astronauts. I think that's something that could change in time, and I would encourage all the young people here to promote that idea with their political leaders so that one day Australia could become part of the international spacefaring community.
Fantastic, Dr. Thomas. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Dr. Andy Thomas there. So far, Australia's only astronaut. He joined the NASA Corps in the late 90s and retired in 2014. He was speaking to me there in 2016 at the World Science Fair. Once again, a huge thanks to the media team at the World Science Fair for getting that interview together for me. It was absolutely fantastic to chat to Dr. Thomas both on and off camera. Of course, Trekzone is all over social media as we gear up for this live rocket launch here on Trekzone Live. Get on our socials, like, follow and subscribe to us across Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell. All of that sort of warm and fuzzy stuff that makes me feel good in the mornings, gets me up in the morning to do all this sort of stuff. And of course, when you're on the go, well, we're podcasting as well. Your favorite podcasting app has our shows updated 5 times a week. So make sure you search for Trekzone in your favorite podcasting app, subscribe, leave a review, and you'll get the latest episodes downloaded straight to your mobile device. Alrighty, well, the Talkin Science is never complete without Dr. Brad Tucker. As I try and string my words together, Dr. Brad and I had a chat in our usual Tuesday record about what this mission means and just exactly what the future holds for NASA and SpaceX. Let's check in with Brad. Alrighty, well, let's get into our biggest story of the week, probably our biggest story of the show, the show's history. SpaceX and NASA are gearing up for a return to crewed missions from the Cape. They're calling it Launch America. It's Demo 2 officially.
That's right. You know, it's a big, exciting thing. And, you know, we've talked about the steps needed in it and all the testing they've been doing and those sorts of things. And, you know, they're definitely both groups, you know, SpaceX as a private company to send humans and NASA to resume launch capability from the US are both excited in this era of this happening. But as you said, importantly, called Demo 2, right? They still are doing the first, you know, kind of the full run. They've done all the various components. Now it's the real salami, so to speak, of doing the whole thing.
I do find it fascinating that the build up to all of this, and yet it is still essentially a space worthiness flight. It really is a demo mission.
Yeah, exactly. It is space worthiness in the truest sense, you know. And then after this, they can, you know, start scheduling it and all that sort of thing, but definitely will be scrutinized. You know, definitely probably the most scrutinized mission, you know, for humans since probably 2004 after the space shuttle resumed after the Columbia disaster. You know, so something in 20 years, really, that this level of scrutiny will be watched for this mission.
Wait, hang on a second, Brad. 2004 was 20 years ago?
Close enough. It doesn't seem like that, but
we're
yes.
old.
Yeah. I mean, look. January feels like 20 years ago.
It certainly does. Well, hey, speaking of this time frame, it's been 9 years since, as I say, it's what I'm saying here with our coverage is that it is a return to crewed flight for Cape Canaveral. It's been 9 years since the shuttle last launched. Now, NASA wasn't expecting it to be this long, but it has been, and there's been some delays to get to this point.
Yeah, you know, they were only planning on maybe a 5-year delay. That was the plan and the hope when they agreed to both SpaceX and Boeing, right? You know, it's both these companies sending humans, NASA astronauts up. And as you said, they weren't waiting for this long, but, you know, it's been the truest sense hard. You know, everything always run over delays, and you don't like that to be always the case. You try and minimize that, but playing it cautious, I think, is one of the reasons why, right? You know, when they've wanted to know something more, something hasn't gone according to plan.
Crew access arm back around the
So we're at
spacecraft.
75% on
So right now, we got down to just inside 17 minutes. The hardware was...
And breaking news, welcome to the Trekzone live stream. We are doing it live, and the launch has been scrubbed this morning. This is breaking news out of the Cape at the moment. We're trying to gather details of exactly what is happening right now, but the launch director has called quits on today's launch. And we will have more details shortly. For now, though, let's go back to my chat with Brad a couple of days ago about exactly what this mission means.
They've played the long game of making sure it's all about safety and that they can do it, because it's not just a validation of SpaceX or Boeing when they do it, or whoever. It's a validation that, you know, private companies now are capable of the holy grail, I guess, of space flight, and that is sending humans into space.
Why did NASA retire the space shuttle?
You know, look, ultimately it was realizing that in order to have their lofty plans of Mars, which, you know, it's been talked about for better part of a decade at least, you know, they needed a new vehicle to do that. The space shuttle was never going to go to the moon. The space shuttle was never going to go to Mars, those sorts of things. The need for a new type of way of getting to the space station, sending cargo, and getting to further places needing to be developed. And the space shuttle was also expensive. It cost $1.2 billion per launch. It's a number we often forget, and that's an expensive number. And if you think about how much they funded the development of SpaceX and Boeing, that's a fraction of the cost to develop these things. So, you know, a bit of money, a bit of long-term thing. And if, you know, the space shuttle was like a 1970s bus. No, not that it wasn't a good bus, but at some point you want to upgrade for more fuel efficiency and, you know, practicalities.
I think the other thing as well that might have really put a dampener on the shuttle was the loss of two of the vehicles at a cost of 14 astronauts. That really did shake the space agency to its core.
Yeah, you know, when Challenger happened in '86, you know, it took 2 years, and everyone agreed that, you know, there was a bit of rush, there was a bit of shortcuts, there was a bit of complacency. You know, get to that culture of the Apollo where, you know, you double checked and, you know, you made sure you could think of all the mistakes. When Columbia happened in February 2003, it kind of really was a sign that there's wear and tear, there's flaws in the design because of the wear and tear, because of how many times they've gone up, and there's no way around that, you know. And now that they're down to 3 shuttles instead of a 5 shuttle rotation, which was the plan, what do they do about it? And, you know, it was probably it wasn't the sole reason, but it, you know, it added to the pile of reasons that we need to start looking at something different and a new way. And it's not negative, right? You know, if you want to go further, you need to try and do bigger and better things. If you're going to just be stagnant at your current level of technology, you're just going to stay at your current level of technology.
Well, that's absolutely right. I think the other thing as well is that it's often overlooked maybe that the shuttle program was actually a success, an expensive success in both money and lives lost, but a success nonetheless. They wanted a reusable spacecraft that could be rocketed into orbit and land back like a glider, and they had that, and it was successful for the better part, more or less successful for the better part of two to 3 decades.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, they had a lot of successful launches in, as you said, in that period. It did exactly what it did, you know, and it operated for the better part of 20 years. And, you know, I think it was a box tick, you know, it's closer to 30, I guess. You know, that's pretty good value. You know, imagine normal aircraft when they come out of a design, even still the same body, they tweak the inside, they do upgrades, they improve engines, they make modifications, and at some point you can't modify it anymore. You just have to build a new airplane, and it doesn't mean the old one was bad. It just means technologies move forward, so keep up with it.
Well, NASA hitched a ride with the Russians on Soyuz for these 9 years to get their crew into orbit and aboard the space station. Why not continue with Soyuz?
There's a couple things. I think there's always a risk when you have all of your eggs in one basket, right? If Soyuz breaks, if Soyuz discovers they have a fatal flaw and they have to redesign it or it's delayed, then you've lost human spaceflight capability. You know, it's always a bit of a risk. There's obviously a bit of national independence. They don't want to always be reliant on another country, especially a group like NASA. it means more people can go up. There's more launches, there's more rotations, there's more experiments, there's more flexibility. And also, as we talked about, the Crew Dragon and Boeing Starliner will pave the way for the equipment needed to go to the moon and other places. So it's not just that they can't use the Soyuz, but this gives them a bit more flexibility and a bit more longitudinal options. And, the Soyuz will still be sending people. And also, they were paying $20 million a seat or so to the Russians for a Soyuz spot. So it's not free.
Still a little bit cheaper than launching a shuttle, though.
Look, still a lot cheaper than launching a shuttle, but you obviously have to dictate your own terms.
Yeah, exactly.
And when you get to do what you want, that's a bit of ease. And Crew Dragon and Boeing Starliner can take more people in a launch than Soyuz. So if there's a need for having more crew per mission and a higher return per mission, like the space shuttle, where they could take 7-8 people, that is possible on these things, which is not possible in the 3-seater Soyuz.
Well, let's dive into today's mission. As we say, it is Demo 2, so they're demonstrating what the capabilities of this craft are. One of them, I'm pretty sure that taking 24 hours to get to the space station is not going to be the norm. It is part of this spaceworthiness flight to make sure that everything's working before they dock with a pretty expensive bit of hardware already in orbit.
That's right. I think, firstly, some people think that once you launch, it's, you're up there in 10 minutes and you're at the space station. It actually does take a while, because once you're in orbit, you have to get into the right orbit and match your orbit. So it is longer than just the 2-hour launch or whatever. However, 24 hours is on the long side. And as you said, they'll be doing lots of checks along the way. They'll be kind of doing pauses. Once they get into orbit, they'll do a series of checks and evaluations, to move on to the next step, to make sure that if they have a flaw, they don't dock with a $150 billion shiny space station. And B, again, the reason also these astronauts were chosen is they're very experienced space shuttle pilots. And one of the points of being the space test flight is they can check not only how is it performing, but how is it performing against the space shuttle? Not that's what you should compare to, but it gives a benchmark for the need of training or evaluation or expectations. There's only so much a dummy, not in the negative sense, but when they actually sent a dummy last year, can tell you about these things. So there'll be a lot of different things they'll look at, and even when they dock to the space station, and even when they're on the space station, it won't just stop there. Their mission will be to evaluate the craft through the whole journey.
That's the one thing I didn't realize about this mission, is that they will actually be not just docking with the space station and leaving, but they'll be docking and staying and continuing the experiments on the craft, on Dragon. Doug and Bob will be joining Expedition 63 already aboard the station. So it's going to get a little crowded up there, but they've sort of got their own mission parameters.
That's right. It's not just a pop up and down. They could spin quite a while up there, and they've actually haven't perfectly defined how long they'll spend up there because of the checks needed. And as you said, they won't really be doing the other space station missions and experiments that the other 3 astronauts are doing. They will have their own thing, which is really evaluating, the Crew Dragon. Again, Crew Dragon hasn't spent a long time in, the vacuum of space. Yes, they've done testing here on Earth, but again, putting it all together is a different story. And that's one of the big things they'll be checking, and making sure there's no problems. And if there is a problem, it needs to detach early. And, let's say it goes horribly wrong. Let's say they dock and then it breaks and they can't get back down. At least there's always the emergency Soyuz capsule up there that they can take. So again, it's all these little things that you have to budget for. And it's simple things. How will the space station adapt to having 2 different types of capsules docked? Small, but you have to test those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And an interesting one as well that I was just thinking of there, that the Crew Dragon, the Dragon capsule, is unproven, and as you say, something, anything could happen. But knowing that there's a safe harbour in the space station is probably a really unique thing in terms of human space flight. There sort of hasn't been a halfway house in orbit.
That's right. People forget they had to do this exact same sort of test with the space shuttle. If that went wrong, not a lot of options, because Skylab wasn't up there. That's an important thing, is they have the ability to put it through the ringer, so to speak, to push its bounds, to make sure it's working, to do that testing, because it's not just about this individual capsule, it's about the entire design. And imagine they do find a flaw. That means it's going to have to be reevaluated, and they'll have to do another test, and look at it that way before they can schedule it. So it's an important thing, and again, it's important for SpaceX, it's important for NASA, and it's important for not just SpaceX, but how Blue Origin and Boeing will be viewed as capable companies of human spaceflight.
And the one last thing that I wanted to touch on is the Falcon 9 rocket. It itself is a proven technology, having been flying these the cargo dragons many times before, and they've been doing their own thing. That's a proven technology as well. But there's a special instrument cluster on board that rocket as well to give feedback on exactly how it's going to perform with a more important, if you will, a payload on board.
That's right. It's a more important payload. The weights and the balance are slightly different. There's vibrations and there's all these sorts of things. The threshold for, carrying a box of food versus a human who doesn't like to be vibrated apart is a bit different. Exactly. So as you said, it's all these little things that, yes, they are all kind of small in their each component, but there's hundreds, thousands of things to look at and evaluate in this launch.
I really don't want to be doing the checklist for this.
It's a long checklist.
A couple of pages at least.
But also, I think we have to just make a note. It will be a different launch experience because of coronavirus. You won't have the crowds that you would normally have. When this thing was originally being planned, Cape Canaveral, Kennedy, they launched, future rocket launches. And, you could buy tickets to launch to be in the area. There was always a limit to saying, they were going to do a lottery and a control system because they knew this was going to be a hugely popular thing and the crowds would be enormous. That is not really possible in the current climate, which is, in some ways a bit of a letdown, but in also ways it forces people to do it virtually and encourages the live streaming and people to tune in from everywhere. So we'll have a bit of a different feel, but also a more modern technology feel of being able to celebrate a really cool milestone from anywhere in the world.
Alrighty, and we are live once again with a shot there of Mission Control in Cape Canaveral. Breaking news that the launch has been scrubbed due to weather. It is understood that a tropical storm has developed off the coast, which is precluding any possibility of launch today. The mission director has called time on that launch, and fuel is being offloaded from the Falcon 9 before the astronauts can safely disembark and head back to quarters and bunk up until Sunday morning Australian time. Another live show inside the Crew Dragon.
Situation.
And as we can hear, the commentary is continuing. The flight loop is quiet at the moment. They are obviously just going through all their checklists. This is all standard procedure with the way these things happen. And as always happens with rocket launches from the Cape, the flight trajectory of the spacecraft is subject to weather conditions as well. That's all the way up to Ireland as it proceeds on a northerly track. So such a large area, and they can never guarantee 100% perfect weather. They accept the risk and they do what they can. Unfortunately, in this instance, it is just too dangerous for a space-worthiness flight to continue. The astronauts there standing by to disembark the spacecraft following today's scrubbing of the launch. Well, that's probably where we're going to wrap it up. There's not too much more that is going to happen. Except for the crew disembarking and heading back to quarters, and a wrap-up of exactly what happened. Thankfully, nothing catastrophic has happened. It is simply just a weather delay. And the next launch window for optimum docking with the space station, which is going to take about 19 hours from launch until docking, is Sunday at 6:22 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. This has been Trekzone Live, and that's the way the cookie crumbles, unfortunately. We will see you again Sunday morning. We will see you next Sunday morning, I promise.
Here we go. We are live, of course.